Thank you for joining our webinar. We're going to wait a bit longer to allow more folks to enter the room before we start. Selamat pagi di Boston. Selamat malam di Indonesia. Good morning in Boston. Good evening in Indonesia. Welcome to our discussion of the implications of the 14 February presidential election for Indonesia's state of democracy, prospects for national development, and future foreign policy. I'm Jay Rosengard, the faculty chair of the Harvard Kennedy School Indonesia Public Policy Program, also known as HKS IP3. Today's event is part of the Global Elections webinar series sponsored by the HKS Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the HKS Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia. With over half of the world's population heading to the polls in 2024, throughout the semester, Harvard scholars will examine a number of elections and electoral trends from across the globe. We hope you will join us at future events throughout the year. I'd like to make a few announcements before we begin our discussion. First, the HKS Ash Center's Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Second, today's discussion is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event. You will also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. Third, kindly note that we will reserve the last 20 minutes of our webinar to respond to questions from you, the audience, to make this as interactive as possible. Questions may be submitted anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As most of Indonesia's more than 200 million registered voters in the world's third largest democracy headed to the polls on February 14th, Valentine's Day, most analysts predicted candidate Prabowo Subianto, in his third attempt at the presidency, would get the most votes, but not more than the 50% needed to avoid a runoff election in June. It thus came as a surprise to many that Prabowo would win by such a wide margin, almost 60% according to initial quick count results. It was an even greater shock to those who grew up under the regime of former President Suharto that Suharto's controversial lieutenant general and one-time son-in-law would ever be a serious contender for the presidency, much less win, given that Prabowo was dishonorably discharged from the army in 1998 and banned from entry into the United States for decades because of alleged involvement in atrocities such as ordering the kidnapping and torture of pro-democracy student activists and commissioning of war crimes in Timor-Leste and Papua. It should be pointed out that Prabowo continues to deny all allegations, has never been convicted, is now defense minister for the extremely popular current president, Joko Widodo, better known as Jokowi, presents himself as an heir to Jokowi, and selected Jokowi's eldest son, Gibran Raka Buming Raka, as his vice presidential running mate. To make sense out of all of this and reflect on the future implications for Indonesia, we are very fortunate today to be joined by two leading Indonesian scholars who have both returned from recent field trips to Indonesia, so they have seen the latest developments and talked with a lot of people on the ground. And coincidentally, Benar, kebetulan. They are both visiting fellows of the Indonesian Studies program at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. First panelist, Dr. Made Supriatma, is an expert on Indonesian politics as well as ethnic identity conflicts and violence. He earned his PhD at Cornell University in the United States and is a former editor of Joyo News. He joined the Indonesian Studies program to conduct research on elections, decentralization, West Papua, and military politics. He is also an early warning fellow at the Simandjuntak Center for the Prevention of Genocide, an institution under the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He is currently the lead author of the Simandjuntak Center report on risks of mass atrocities in West Papua. Our second panelist, Dr. Deasy Simandjuntak, is both a political scientist and a political anthropologist. She completed her PhD at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands and is assistant professor at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Deasy publishes on Indonesian democracy politics and Southeast Asian democracy. One of her latest publications has a very intriguing title, Disciplining the Accepted, Amputating the Deviants, Segregated Religious Citizenship in Indonesia. And we especially appreciate the participation of these two well-known panelists because it's very late at night. We have Made live from Taiwan and Deasy live from Singapore. So it's about 10 p.m. at night their time. So we very much appreciate your making the time and effort to join us. To be transparent, our panelists have no idea what I will ask them, and my desire to have spontaneity in our discussion, rather than passive, prepared comments or PowerPoints. It also reflects my full faith and confidence in the knowledge and creativity of our panelists. So let the fun begin. My first question, and this one is for both Made and Deasy, maybe starting with Made. How did Prabowo win? And how did he win by such a landslide? And I'd like you to consider two factors in your response. The first is about the candidates. Mm-hmm. What is so appealing about Prabowo, or what is so unappealing about his two opponents? Maybe a little bit about where his Prabowo's political base is, his constituency. And the second is about the process, the campaign and the election itself. Do you think it was a fair and free election? So I know that Made can talk hours about this, but he'll give us a brief response and then we'll have follow-up questions and discussion. So over to you, Made.
Thank you. Just a little bit correction, Jay. I'm not a PhD. I haven't finished my
it's all but dissertation, but it's a work in progress. And in Indonesia, to be fair, we consider Made part of what I affectionately call the Cornell Mafia.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the correction.
I think what's so appealing about Prabowo, I think a lot of people still have a nostalgia about the new order, especially those who grew up as the sons of the civil servant, sons of the military and the police during the new order, who got the privilege, I think at the time, to enjoy education. And now I think it's a fill up so many parts in the Indonesian middle class. That's appealing. And for the common people, for the lower class, I think the appeal for him is as a strong leader. That's as for sure his military background, his patriotism, and he always say that I am ready to sacrifice my life for the nations. Yeah, that's kind of cheap nationalism, if you want to say that. And not so appealing about two other candidates. Anies Baswedan, I think, from poll to polls was pegged in 25%. he never exceed that number, so they knows exactly. So I think how did Prabowo win is by they cleverly known beforehand that the only way, because the Anis base of this 25% is very stable, so they couldn't get votes from Anis. So the only way for them is getting vote from Ganjar. So I think as I saw in the film, they tried to separate the vote for PDIP, which the Ganjar's party, and Ganjar's Pranowo as the presidential candidate. And in October, Ganjar's electability was 37%, but then it's going down, 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 and now he got only 17% left because Prabowo taking over it. Well, did these elections fair? I have written an articles in the conclusion. I say that this is the election. This is very, very close to the new order election. So many similarity because of the Jokowi factors. Of course, he is a very, very popular president, but at the same time, he also uses the state apparatuses, especially the police, with the backup of the military and the civil servant, the village head. And please don't forget also half of Indonesian regional leaders, because of the law, has to resign in 2023. So they are not elected, but selected by Jokowi. So Jokowi has an immense power to move the state for Prabowo's favor. And the result you see is the latest number that I saw, 58.89, so close to 60%. The results also reveals this very, very close to the new order election. So I have no doubt, after experiencing the new order, after seeing what's going on in the field at the grassroots level, this is just purely the new order election. And my field research was in Central Java and Yogyakarta. I think I better stop at this. Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, before we go over to Deasy, a little bit of information for those not familiar with Indonesia. So when Madi says a new order, that's the Suharto regime for 32 years. And the two opponents, Anis was a rector of Paramadina University, a private university, and then he was Minister of Education, and he was governor of Jakarta. And the other opponent, Ganjar, was governor of I guess he was a member of the national legislature first, and then governor of Central Java, I believe, twice. So that's just a little bit of background information. So in sum, if it seems to be like a rerun of the New Order, maybe it's something like Back to the Future. You don't have to answer that. Now over to Deasy. What is your take on all of this?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Jay, and thank you, Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center, for inviting me. It's such an honor to meet you and also to talk again with Made Supriatma. He's my senior and friend. We've already talked about Indonesia 2024 election in ISEAS just last Tuesday. So my field work was in North Sumatra, so I can take a look at it from not from the central government or central state kind of point of view, so from outer island, let's say. So how did the voters vote for Prabowo? Okay. This is perhaps repeated so many times, but I think it's true. The Jokowi factor, the J factor here, is very influential, both because he's popular and secondly also because he has the power, right? Also, or presumed power, right? During my field work, for example, I would go from one rally to another, and during the rally of Prabowo and Gibran, Prabowo was openly, praising Jokowi as a good president, praising him openly on the stage. And he was, of course, dancing with Jokowi's son, right, Gibran. And on the same stage, Jokowi's son-in-law, Bobi Nasution, who is the mayor of Medan, the capital city of North Sumatra, he's also on the stage dancing, right, with his wife, the wife of Gibran. So all Jokowi's family there, plus Prabowo, dancing together, happy, right? That was what's happening. So it's visually very attractive for Jokowi's millions of loyal followers, right? And again, this also means that the alleged unneutrality of state apparatuses is not alleged, really, because Bobi is the mayor of Medan. He's supposed to be, neutral. But hey, he's openly campaigning for his brother-in-law, right? And secondly, at the same time, Jokowi was also in the province, North Sumatra, at the same day, on the same day, but maybe not at the same place, but he was also distributing staple food packages, right? For a lot of, ama-ama, for a lot of ibu-ibu that came in another district, but in the same province, so people connect that, oh yeah, Jokowi did not conceal his preference for Prabowo and Gibran pair. And secondly, and this is very, I think, outer island kind of point of view, or so North Sumatra point of view, voters actually seek closeness, to the central government. Indonesia has had decentralization, since 1999, right? But still, these regions would like to have, some sort of a real connection to the central state, just to get, an easier access to financial assistance, for example, the dana this, dana that, right, for them. And North Sumatra is not an exception. Back in 2020, Bobi Nasution, when he was campaigning to be mayor, he did say that, and very, very clearly, he said, well, if you chose me, I'll make you closer to central state. I will call the ministers in Jakarta so that they can help you, in Medan, right? So that's pretty clear from the Medan or North Sumatra point of view. And number three, Prabowo himself portrays the image of a strong leadership. And this is me being a political anthropologist here. This is a political ethnography side of my research. This kind of strong man leadership is very attractive to the majority ethnic group there, which is the Batak, right? I'm also a Batak, and traditionally we really are very patriarchal ethnicity, and we kind of like leaders that exude this kind of strongman leadership. And number four, this is the last one in my point of view. Remember that the youth voters in Indonesia this year is there's a lot of them, right? 52% of youth voters or first-time voters. At the same time as Prabowo is exuding this strongman image, he also portrays a relaxed kind of image, right? The gemoy, the dancing. Actually, on the stage, he would be dancing more than he spoke, right? He would be dancing, he would be asking actually people like, do you want to see me dance? Like that. And everybody would say, yeah. And then that song, that okay gas, that kind of song, that the youth really like. Then he would be dancing and everybody's happy. And then he would be saying like, don't you want a free lunch? And everybody said, yeah, so this kind of, gimmick or maybe kind of portrayal of a very asik leader, a very relaxed leader is very attractive for 52% of the voters. So basically everybody just wanted him to dance. So, so this is what it is, right? The youth, the young voters are actually voting for Prabowo for a different reason, maybe, than the older voters, maybe. So that's what I think.
I'd like to underline the point that Deasy first made about giving a perspective of North Sumatra, because often people divide Indonesia into Java, Bali, the center, which is about 60% of the population, the economy, and then the outer islands. They say Eastern Indonesia, but if you look at a map, Sumatra is clearly to the west. But it's basically on and off Java, Bali. And people mistake, they say, well, Java is Indonesia or Jakarta is Indonesia, and it's really very, very complicated. So we appreciate that perspective. One follow-up question for each of you, back to Made. Again, trying to understand the voter base between Prabowo and the opposition. Deasy mentioned age as one fact that more than half of the eligible voters are between 17 and 40, and about 1/3 are under 30. And that 1/3 under 30 means that they were either born after Suharto or were young children when Suharto resigned. And if we could disaggregate that a bit, because for that young group, you have splits. You have urban, rural. You have middle class versus maybe less educated, maybe lower middle class or lower income households, and then you have location. I was wondering if you look at those demographics, because that demographic also is our Indonesian students at Harvard.
Right.
And I can say overwhelmingly they're not happy with the results. And so maybe if we could unpackage that a little bit, are there splits within the youth, and are there other distinguishing factors on those who support Prabowo? Like I said, urban, rural, or income, social income, or location, or whatever. So again, we're trying to unpack the 60% who voted for Prabowo. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that Prabowo won across demographic. Young people overwhelmingly voted for him, and what the poll had said also, I think the results confirm what the poll has predicted. But also in terms of geography, also Prabowo won. Prabowo won in Sumatra, Kalimantan, Java, and any other island, almost in all over island. And he lost only in 3 provinces to Anies Baswedan, Aceh, Sumatra Barat, and then I forgot the other one, but Jakarta back to Prabowo's column just yesterday. So I think it's pretty clear that he is a very dominant force at every level across region and also across religion. The only and if you look at I happen to look at exit poll yesterday from Indicator Politik Indonesia, the only ethnic group where Prabowo lost was Minangkabau in West Sumatra. So that goes to Anies. So Anies voters basically, as we can predict, is more Islamic conservatives, and Ganja's voters, I think it's mostly PDIP, but that was outside Central Java and East Java and Yogyakarta. So I think that's why he got a very, very little votes from PDIP. And then also most of the, in terms of rural, urban, and the young people, I think, well, in the urban, I think it's more diverse. You can see that just 3 days before the elections, activists in Jakarta released a movie titled Dirty Votes. Just in 48 hours, that movie got 20 million views. But it didn't sway the elections. So sadly, I think 2019 also they released Sexy Killers, would got 30 million votes. It didn't sway the election too. So but it's a good education. And if you look at the exit poll told us that urban voters is much more diverse than the rural. I think the rural voters, sure, they are exposed to social media, but in the rural area, I think you have to follow your leaders, your village head, for example, or your neighborhoods chairs. So that kind of things, Prabowo, I think, won in every demographic, also in geography, and everything. They're very, very dominant. So it's astonishing for me that in the democracy you can get such a vote, such large vote, and build not I think we should not call it a coalition, but a nation of supporting you. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Thank you very much for unbundling it. I mean, to get 60% of the votes, you pretty much have to cut across all the demographics, and you've explained in great detail. And one follow-up question for Deasy before we open it up to the audience. It's about the J factor, not me, Jay, but Jokowi, right?
Okay.
And the question is, how much do you think Jokowi tipped the scales in favor of Prabowo? And let me just name some things that people have cited. And in your opinion, were these major factors or not? Things that they cited as saying the Jokowi factor was instrumental goes back to appointing Prabowo as his defense minister. For those who don't know, Prabowo ran against Jokowi twice and lost. And so then Jokowi makes him his defense minister. What does that mean? The second point, and you mentioned this about the handouts of the money, but the increase in social spending now is greater than at the height of COVID. It's a lot of money. I work a lot with the Ministry of Finance. I know it's a lot of money. So it's the great rapid increase in social spending. That's the second factor people talk about. The kind of engineering eligibility of his son to run with Prabowo.
Sure.
For those who don't know, the Constitutional Court made an exception to the 40-year-old age limit, not by age, but if you're in elective politics. Now, the son is 36. So that was an exception, and people point out that the Chief Justice, gentleman Anwar Usman, is the President Jokowi's brother-in-law, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And then the other factor that people raise, this is just in public discussion. We don't know how valid it is, how important. Well, and you mentioned this, by law, the president is not allowed to campaign, or the governor. You know, an elected official is supposed to be neutral. And you talked about how it was like, not exactly campaigning, but people were pretty connect the dots. And then there were also accusations of harassment of volunteers and supporter of Prabowo's opponents. So this has all been circulating in social media and by some analysts. So if you put it all together, do you think it made any difference? Are these claims valid? What do you think?
Well, certainly from North Sumatra point of view and experiences, some of those elements that you have touched upon are actually valid, you know, like especially the neutrality of state apparatuses. I also receive a lot of reports, and I cannot check myself, but there's a lot of those reports that the village heads, for example, they're not neutral. They were, you know, they said gathered together by their superior and was ordered to mobilize, you know, voters to vote for a certain candidate, you know, something like that. Also, the handout of staple food packages, but that's generally have already been reported in the media, actually. So there's no secret on that. And then and also banknotes. And again, this is the political anthropology side of this. Banknotes were distributed, in adat gatherings, in I don't know, for those of us who are not really familiar with Indonesian terms, adat is a traditional or cultural event, right? So this handing out of banknotes are masqueraded, in some sort of a cultural gesture, which is acceptable for certain, cultures, especially the Batak. Actually, it's acceptable to receive some sort of a banknotes before a festivity, so that you get reminded that you have to go there to that festivity because you have received the money to go there. So that kind of thing was happening, and so there's some people from the election monitoring body that would, talk to me and said, what are we going to do about it? We're not really mandated to stop cultural events. That's something very confusing for them, as well as what you mentioned. What's that? What did you mention just now? I forgot. The first one.
You covered it, don't worry. I think you bundled it together, so
yeah,
I think it's fine.
So,
I think with that, we've got some great questions. So we're going to start with a follow-up question from the audience from Ade. I'll read it. It says, a hallmark of the New Order regime, as I understand it at least, was creating a very dangerous, hostile environment for intellectuals and/or anyone perceived as being leftist. But in 1965, it was also a different political movement with the Cold War and communism, and even the USA's CIA involvement. Do you worry about some of the same issues for this, in quotations, New Order reboot? Or are things fairly different in 2024? This is for you, Made.
I'm very worried actually. Then people, I never call myself being a leftist, but because I wrote for what is that, a left-leaning progressive magazine before. I think and even until now in the Progress, I think people put me in that category. And then it's already the sign for that is already emerged. You look at how the what is that, the Preman, the thugs, the paramilitary, the thugs then becomes the paramilitary has emerged right now, securing Prabowo, and then they are really cheering up because this is their win right now. And then I think it soon will be, if there's something happen, is like the political crisis in Indonesia, the first thing that will become the target is the leftists, and of course the second thing is the minorities. But I think it's the leftists is easier to gather because a lot of paramilitary and also the military leading organizations still using this as a political issues. Yes, I think I'm myself become very, very worried about this actually. Yeah.
And actually, before we go to Deasy, because this is a follow-up question for you, this is related to the previous question, Made. What is the outlook for the free practice of non-Muslim religions?
Non-Muslim religion, I think this is a good news. Looking at the not a good news actually. I'm sorry, I mischaracterized that. If you are, I think it's confirmed that all of the radicals, I think, is in any side, so they are locked in the 25%, and I think it's right now. I think it's being in the normal situation, just like in the New Order. They are in the minority quarters, even though they can be very loud. But it's, as always, they will be very loud. But they are minority. They are nothing in the electoral politics. But in other religions, I think Prabowo himself, I still have a hope that he comes from a minority. He's all of his brother or sister-in-law, his brother and sister are Christians. His mom is a Christian. He's the only one who's Muslim. He's not practicing. He's not really devout, and I don't think he cares about the religion so much. So in 2019, I think Jokowi was very successful, defined him as a Muslim radical. So and then voters believe that. And then you remember that every Friday people ask people in Jokowi's camp ask a question: where would Prabowo have his private prayer? So that's kind of question. And actually, he's not really care about religion, and I think what he cares is about power.
Thank you. And this is there's a question from the audience for Deasy, and it's kind of building on your dancing motifs, which I think is kind of nice, and I'll read it. Sometimes, or some people say that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Maybe in Indonesia it's dance, but the prose still must follow. What does Prabowo mean for Papua, Aceh, economic policy, and the survival of the already seriously eroded public oversight institutions like KPK, which is the Corruption Eradication Commission? Over to you, Deasy.
Thank you, Jay. Actually, for Papua, Mas Made is the
expert. Okay.
on this. Yeah. So perhaps that he would be able to answer that particular Papua.
Okay.
Yeah. But you know, people are this is the thing. I think today I actually received some sort of a a message from a friend from the Philippines who got a message from an Indonesian friend that voted for Prabowo, right? Saying that we voted for Prabowo because Jokowi supported Prabowo, right? So they think that when they voted for Prabowo, they're actually voting for Jokowi. This is a misunderstanding, I think, because Prabowo is not Jokowi. And of course, right now, he benefited from Jokowi's popularity. That's true. But when he becomes president, I don't think, that he would be following to the teeth, Jokowi's policy. Prabowo stands for a lot of different things, from Jokowi. Since 2019, we know that he implied this also in 2024, that he's into strong state, right? Authoritarianism. He doesn't use the word, but kind of a stronger state, right? And Jokowi has never said that, both in 2014, 2019. And also, Prabowo has always been a kind of some sort of a strong populist leader, and Jokowi, even when he is a populist, it's kind of meek and kind of technocrat, rather than exuding this kind of power. So I suspect when he becomes president, a lot of things will change, except perhaps the IKN, the capital city project perhaps will stay the same, and that's one of the very few things that will stay the same, I think.
Before we let Madi talk a little bit about Papua, I think you've raised the perceptions of many when asked what will domestic policy be, and people don't know. It's like which Prabowo will emerge. He's in the past been an economic nationalist, for example. And that also extends to foreign policy, which I think we'll answer in a moment. But sticking with domestic development policy, in the past, a lot of his stances have not been the same as Jokowi, but on the campaign trail, he says, "I will do everything the same." So it's a question mark. Specifically, to our expert on Papua, what do you think, Made?
Yeah, I think in Papua, there's a lot of chapters already among Papuans, the native Papuans, about the bleak futures for Papuans, because not only Prabowo has a very bad human rights records, but also he has a huge interest in exploiting West Papua's natural resources. Jokowi has said that Papua is the last capital, the resources that Indonesia needs to build Indonesia. And then Prabowo will do that no matter what, to exploit everything that he could in order to develop Indonesia. Related to probably whether he will continue Jokowi's policies or not, I think the biggest problem right now for him is waiting is that would he have money to finance all of this huge project, the new capital city? And then it's very funny because they are still making a new law about Jakarta, a special region of Jakarta, which will, I think, under the agreement between Prabowo and Jokowi, it will go under the jurisdiction of the Vice President. So Gibran Rakabuming Raka, Jokowi's sons, will get Jakarta, which more than 60% of Indonesia's economy is activities is going on right now. And then Prabowo will get Nusantara, the new capital city, which need a huge investment that Jokowi couldn't get it from anywhere else. So what he would do about that? I think should he abandon that project because it's not really a lot of people thought that this is no use for Indonesia right now to have that new capital with a big investment like that. So yeah, it's a lot of things like his campaign promise. 450 trillion rupiah, where the monies come from. How can he finance that? And how can he, maintain the infrastructure that is being built by the president? And also how he deal with the all of the debt. Especially the debt by the state companies, which is almost half of the debt of Indonesia as a state. So it's a huge problem ahead. And not to forget, is this a very uncertain situation because he's 72. I think this will create among the elites right now, even among the elites, what I heard from Jakarta was that there's a sense that we in 65 right now, because Sukarno was ailing at that time, and now we have the president, the elect, who is not in a very good condition. Should we give, if something something happened, should we give this to Gibran, which is very inexperienced, or should we give it to who will be responsible for this great nations? That's a big problem ahead, and we don't know the answer. A big uncertainty, especially for me, yeah, as the one who observing Indonesian politics very closely.
Thank you. I mean, in putting on my public finance hat for a moment, the point you made about a state enterprise debt, that's all off budget. So when you look at national figures, debt to the size of the economy, debt to GDP, it doesn't appear.
Right.
But we all know that if a state enterprise gets into problems and can't pay the debt, it's going to have to come from the budget. There's no budget allocation. There's no budget line item, and something else is going to have to pay for it. Same thing with the new capital in East Kalimantan. That means you can't invest in making Jakarta more climate resilient.
Right.
You know, it's North Coast. You've got flooding issues all along the north coast of Java. And it's a zero-sum game, and there are very strict limits on how much the deficit can be in the annual budget. So when you look at all of this, and the answer is, well, the private sector will pay for it all, which has not yet happened. So I think all of these, you know, so we've got from Deasy kind of the politics, and then you add the economics, and you get a very complicated political economy set of scenarios with a lot of unanswered questions. Going back to the election a bit, there are two related questions. Deasy talked about the Jokowi factor, but these raise the M factor, Megawati PDIP factor. And I should say that was Jokowi's party, and people expected him to support Ganjar from his complicated things. So if you could answer in a way, so those who really don't understand the details of Indonesian internal politics could try to make sense of the question and your response.
Me?
Either one of you.
Yeah, I think
For
because it's
Central
central.
Java, Mas Made.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's Central Java. I think
Okay, so
I think
okay.
it's the other way around, because you have to remember, Jokowi owed Megawati and PDIP 7 elections, and he won all. 5 for himself, 1 for his son, 1 for his son-in-law. Yeah, it's not the other way around. Yeah, and then he asked Mega first, Bu Mega, once, could I get another term? And Megawati said no. Could I have extension 2 or 3 years? Because of the COVID, because of the pandemic. And Megawati said no. Yeah, that's real. So yeah, and then I think Jokowi's people's always exploiting the what is that? The words Petugas Partai, the party official, which is a kind of Jokowi makes it as a kind of insult to himself. But the word himself, the term itself came from for himself. I think it's the first time it came up when he won the first election to become the mayor of Solo. And he said very clearly, now I'm Petugas Partai and Petugas Rakyat. I'm a party official and the people's officials. That's very clear. It's coming from him. It's not coming from. And then the way that he won in Central Java and in Bali, I think this is a very, very targeted, these 2 regions very, very targeted by separating Ganjar and PDIP. So I think I interviews a lot of PDIP legislative candidate. They are even scared to carry Ganjar's banner, to distribute his t-shirts. So because the police summoned them to their office and say that, please don't campaign for Ganjar. You can do whatever you want, but don't campaign for Ganjar. So that's why Ganjar got beaten badly in Central Java, Yogyakarta, and Bali. So looking at that kind of things, I think a lot of people probably in the university, the university is a very insulated bubble right now, like as always, and I don't think they pay attention a lot about what's going on. And then please also remember that the Indonesian university in the last 10 years, it's become what is that? It's become the market institutions more and more. So state support the university less and less, and the university has to rely on themselves, on the business sides, making money. So if you see that Indonesian university, especially the state universities, becomes more and more middle class, the poor couldn't afford to go to that university. So I think it's a perfect bubble for intellectuals I don't think if you want to see the public intellectuals, you have to look at outside the university. Right?
It's interesting. You say bubble. In the United States, we say ivory tower. It's like you're cut off from reality. Deasy,
Yeah.
anything to add to that?
Just that there is a decoupling, right, between the legislative election and the presidential election. So people would vote for PDIP candidate. PDIP is still the strongest party, right, in the parliament. So people would vote for PDIP candidate as their, choice of parliament member, but then would vote for Prabowo for presidential candidate. So that this is also happening in a lot of provinces in outside of Java, right? So somehow Ganjar was not very attractive to a lot of voters. Perhaps also because I don't know to what level the presidential debate really influences how people form their political preference, but we see. I mean, as scholars, we kind of like how Ganjar use all these jargons because we understand that and we recognize that, but not common people, right? His explanation is always very some sort of there in the air, whereas Prabowo is saying things like "sorry, yeah," like that. It's it's much more attractive, and so it's Ganjar personality wise, unfortunately. Not very attractive for a lot of campaign as a Jokowi party, right? Everywhere we see that, on the banners, like, oh, this is Jokowi's party, you vote for it. Prabowo won. A lot of PSI elite, were on the square when Prabowo was campaigning. Prabowo won, but PSI didn't get into didn't get the parliamentary threshold. So there's really no coattail effect. I mean, like really less coattail effect. Maybe Nasdem a bit because it's, Nasdem gets some sort of a, Muslim vote somehow because it is, supporting Anis. Yeah.
Maybe as time is running out, I'd like to have this last round about foreign policy. We have a couple of questions about this. What would be Prabowo's foreign policy? What does it mean for Indonesia's relations with great powers, China, the U.S.? And then related to that, do you see much change in foreign policy? Who will be the new foreign minister? You don't have to speculate on the cabinet, but generally in terms of possible impact on relations with ASEAN, as well as relations with, let's focus on U.S. and China. Do you see any dramatic change?
Yeah, is it me?
Both of you.
Okay, let me handle this first. I think it's a Prabowo, as we see, that he's very nationalistic. Actually, he believes he's very in his foreign policy. He's a realist, I think, but focusing on Indonesia. He said it over and over again that if you want to be respected, you have to have power. Otherwise, you will be like Gaza. That's what he said. Yeah, it's a very offensive remark in his first debate. But I think I've been watching him for quite some time, so probably since his first run as a president. And he's always put Indonesia first, borrowing the term from the United States. So Indonesia first, I think he will focus on Indonesia, but he's trying to gain some influence in Southeast Asia. But I don't think he will be interested to solve the problem in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, for example, like in Burma, for example. He tried to avoid that, which is for me, I think it's a little bit sad because Indonesia is, as if you remember history correctly, in the 80s, Indonesia has a big role in making peace in Cambodia. I think Indonesia has the capacity to do that in Burma, but I don't think Prabowo will be interested in that. And then in terms of relations with the United States, I think he is interested in weaponry for the military. And I think he was educated in the US as a soldier in Fort Benning, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So yeah, he's a part of elite soldiers in Indonesia and in training in the US. but not like President Yudhoyono, who has, I often mock President Yudhoyono as making the US his second country. That's what he acknowledged. But I think there's a love and hate relations between Prabowo in the US. He was banned for a long time, and he always he believed in some sort of conspiracy theories against the US. But in the China, I don't think he will be as close as Jokowi in terms of military relations and everything. I think he much more leaning toward the US. But that is my really what is that guessing what it will be like Prabowo's foreign policy in the next terms.
Thank you. I mean, it's a little bit like domestic policy. You're not quite
Right.
sure what will dominate.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Deasy, your perspective on the impact on foreign policy?
Yeah, just very quickly. Because we're actually paying attention to what he's saying about foreign policy around the time when he's actually running for something, right? So we don't really know what he's saying is actually geared towards really foreign policy or geared at attracting votes domestically, right? So I would like to draw your attention to this episode in the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, maybe last year, if I'm not mistaken, in which that he offered a very strange proposal to solve the Russia-Ukraine war, right? I think it's one of those, like both sides have to withdraw some sort of, 100 meters or something like that, which really offended the Ukrainian representative and the EU representative at that time. So, and a lot of people saying, is this Indonesian proposal or is this a Russian proposal? Like that, so that kind of proposal that he's giving, and it was also unasked, that kind of. So a lot of people will think of it as him saying that he's taking the stance of a strong state and pro-Russia and whatever. But I don't think it's true. It's just that he's saying this because a lot of people in Indonesia are pro-Russia, right? They kind of lean towards. I mean, I'm saying this with a grain of salt, because a lot of people say that they're pro-Russia because Russia is a strong state, and a lot of people in Indonesia would like some strong state. So my point is that we don't really know, what kind of foreign policy he's gonna, adopt. Whether what he's saying is really geared upon foreign policy or is it just to attract domestic. At the same time, also very quickly, 2019, he did say something criticizing Chinese investment in Indonesia because there's a lot of Chinese influx of Chinese workers in Indonesia. And people say that as him rejecting China's investment. It's not true. It's just geared, for his followers that don't want a lot of migrant workers coming to Indonesia. So we don't know. That's my point.
Yeah, and just a quick perspective from the U.S., because these were some questions people asked when they registered. My guess from the U.S., it really didn't matter which of the three candidates won, and it probably won't matter which candidate in the U.S. wins in our upcoming election. The U.S., and you have to separate the U.S. government from the American people. And the U.S. government, it's strategic, it's tactical, it's transactional. And, they know how important Indonesia is with the minerals, with the strategic location, with the conflict or the competition with China and so on. So I think, whoever would have won the election, the government would basically pursue their own best self-interest. And in that sense, when Prabowo visited his defense minister, it was business. It was weapon sales and, strategic relationships, trying to have at least on the surface, Indonesia remaining non-aligned and neutral. And as long as the U.S. doesn't force Indonesia to choose between China and the U.S., I think the policy. Now, American people, if Prabowo were to come to a university campus to speak, there might be a lot of
Exactly.
protests over the human rights allegations and so on. So that's from the American perspective.
Mhm. Mhm.
Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And I think we've reached our time limit, and it's especially very, very late where you guys are. So I think the audience would like to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists for so generously sharing your insights with us. And I'm
Thank
sure
you
our
very much.
dialogue will continue. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you
And
for having
sweet
me,
dreams.
Jay. Yeah,
Very much.
appreciate that. Thanks.
Good night.